Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don, and I hope you're having a lovely day today. I am having a lovely day today. And as we come down to the end of year 23, um, coming into really the last couple of weeks, and lots of lots of year-end things going on. I hope you're having a good end to your calendrical year. As you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type in your comment or question on whatever platform you might be watching on. It will show up here in my chat room, and we can talk directly. And I find that one of the parts of the broadcast I most enjoy. And and today is my subject is ghost stories and their connection to the winter solstice. And depending on how the conversation goes, I was going to talk about the interaction of the horror genre um, and the pagan community in the modern world. Now, hello to Calvin in the chat room. It's good to see you, Calvin. Um, it is a very old custom to tell ghost stories at the winter solstice. This is how the ghosts get into Dickens' Christmas Carol. They were not an odd addition at that time. The idea, and hello to Jason in the chat room. It's good to see you, Jason. The idea of ghosts connected to the winter solstice is connected with the fact that it was connected with the fact that the winter solstice traditionally was a year-end festival. And as all year-end festivals, it celebrated the death of the old year and the birth of the new year, and therefore anything dealing with the dead, with ghosts, was part of the ceremony. And um, this is a part that we've largely forgotten about today, but it's really only recently been forgotten about. And um, as late as the Second World War, ghosts were still often associated, at least in some parts of the English-speaking world, with the winter solstice. And um, I think it's something we might do well to bring back. But then I've always been heavily associated with spiritualism and working with the dead. Um, it is important, I think, for us to remain connected to our ancestors, connected to the past, and also, there's always a little thrill involved in ghost stories. And the like, hello to Krista in the chat room. It's good to see you, Krista. Um, and um, I think that it's kind of hard, I think, to think of winter without thinking about the idea of death of um, much of the plant life, death of the calendrical year. And so it's natural also to think about our own mortality. And I'm not quite, well, I do actually have a pretty good idea why this disappeared from the holidays, because around the early part of the 20th century, a lot of people started thinking of it as being a holiday for children. And the more age-inclusive aspects of the holiday were increasingly left behind in favor of making it all about children, which was very much a late 19th, early 20th century attitude. And I don't know that it really is an attitude that I agree with. I think that it would be very good for us to bring back the ghost stories at the solstice. Now, I was also going to talk a little bit about the interaction of the horror genre and the pagan community. And as you know, several times in the last couple of years, I've done Lord Don's Library of Horror, where we looked at a number of horror films and talked about them in terms of their metaphysical significance. Um, and I think that not every horror film has any kind of metaphysics, physical significance. A lot of them don't. But those that do can be very interesting to look at. Um, I have often said that my favorite horror film is The Mummy from 1932, which I also consider one of the best metaphysical films that has been made. And The Mummy is basically about reincarnation and the idea that reincarnation is better than physical immortality, and why. And of course, the horror aspect of the film is what most people notice. But if you look past that, there's a lot of metaphysics in that film. It says a lot to metaphysics in the 1920s and 30s, but even today, because these considerations of physical immortality versus reincarnation are still things that are relevant to metaphysical thought. Um, Some of the other ones we've looked at, we looked at The Ghoul, which is again a film dealing with Egyptian revivalism in the 20s and 30s, um, and how that affected the life of the main character. One of the things that I liked about both The Mummy and to a lesser extent The Ghoul is that they came at their subject matter from the point of view of their subject matter. Um, it didn't have this heavy level of Christianity imposed over it that you sometimes see when Hollywood makes a film dealing with metaphysics or paganism. Um, the Mummy is entirely within the context of ancient Egyptian and or Egyptian revivalist um, spiritual thought. To the extent that there's anything else there, it is shown as being largely irrelevant. Um, and I find that very refreshing. The other thing about The Mummy that is very refreshing is that the hero who saves the damsel in distress is the damsel in distress. She saves herself by calling on the goddess Isis, which is, I think, a spiritually enlightened conclusion you don't see very often in later films. Um, and is something to recommend it. But I was going to talk a little also about the influence of Hollywood horror on the actual pagan community. One of the things, for me, oh, and hello to Lady Kai from Buffalo. It's good to see you, Kai. And one of the things for me, they talk about representation being important. One of the things for me growing up, and even now, I always find it a little thrilling to see my religious and spiritual point of view actually represented. And it doesn't happen all that often. But when it does, it has a lot of meaning. I think that's probably one of the reasons I'm so fond of The Mummy from 1932 and some of these other films. And why I do look at these films to see what actual metaphysical references they have. There are, I think, two major effects of Hollywood. Hello to Tom in the chat room. It's good to see you, Tom. There are two major effects of Hollywood horror films on the modern pagan community, by which I mean throughout the 20th century. One of them is visual. I think the way that Hollywood has chosen to look at paganism has had a certain amount of influence on how actual contemporary modern pagans look at themselves. And that is both when it actually is a representation of some idea of paganism and also metaphysics in general. There's been a lot of influence, I think, on the kind of robes you would commonly see in our community, for example. based on what you might see in movies. Certainly not as its exclusive origin by any means. And a certain amount of it is also influenced by the general Gothic genre. But I think that a certain amount of visual effect has come through the way that Hollywood looks at these things, including the fact that it tends to be very eclectic in how things get put together. The other thing, however, that I think the horror genre has tended to do is it does tend to increase the level of superstition around certain things. I often talk about how the Ouija board was a common item for generations with no particular problems until it was featured in the movie The Exorcist. And suddenly everyone became afraid of it, and it gained reputations it had never had in decades of use. Hello to Jeanette in the chat room. And Krista says they still push the satanic panic on the media. And Krista says, you never read, police found lots of materials of practicing Catholics and Bibles in the home of criminal X. And that can be true. And I would have to say that part of that satanic panic that we saw back in the 80s and 90s certainly did get a push, not only from certain figures in the paranormal world whose actual purpose seems to have been to frighten people away from metaphysics, but certainly from the Hollywood take on horror films, which, of course, it's a horror film. It's supposed to be frightening and so forth. But I think sometimes people forget that that is the case, and it is not a genuine look at metaphysics. And you have people like, certain paranormal researchers who basically write about their adventures as if they were horror stories and with about the same level of credibility. And it certainly doesn't help anything. And the paranormal programs that have been done in recent years, I don't think we can really call them Hollywood as such, but in the media, also in many cases, have been very inducive towards superstition. I've often talked about how almost anything that happens, the paranormal researcher in some of these programs will decide is a demon in the basement, no matter how minor the situation was. And they will have what I would consider hysterical reactions to situations that would be very easy to deal with. I remember watching one, and I was watching it because a friend of mine was watching it, but there was apparently a poltergeist activity happening. One of the notable things was a box flying off a shelf and hitting someone in the back. But that's not a big horror film happening. That's a minor poltergeist activity. What do you do with a poltergeist? You ground the energy. The idiot in this program instead was suggesting they should sell their house for pennies and move to another state. And I've always been horrified by that. If that is your reaction, you do not have good training. And with things like that, what you need to do is you need to ground the energy. And if you watch a lot of, I enjoy horror films. I enjoy the classic horror films often much more than current horror films, but I enjoy them. But I also recognize them for the most part as fantasy pictures. I look at them in the same way I might look at a science fiction fantasy film or something like The Lord of the Rings. I may enjoy it. I may enjoy the concepts they explore, but I don't mistake them for reality. And occasionally there are real things, but very often they're being presented from a certain point of view, which is not connected to the real world. And I think that is important to remember. However, again, they do have a certain amount of influence. I think again, often visually, and also a negative influence in increasing the level of superstition. And Kai says current horror films just aren't as good anymore. Most are too predictable, and I have to agree. A lot of them are very formulaic. Um, Now, I'm not going to say that I haven't seen any good ones um, in more modern periods. I can think of a number that I quite enjoyed. Um, One of the ones I really enjoyed was The Others, and if you're not familiar with The Others, it deals heavily with the subject of the afterlife, and in what I think is a very realistic way. Um, Certainly not a universal way, but a way that a lost spirit, a spirit caught between the worlds, could very easily encounter, and how other spirits would interact with them. And um, the best thing about the film is that it's not immediately obvious what the actual subject matter is, which I think is always highly desirable. And Kai says, yes, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, it's the same 5 plot lines with different names, and I'm afraid I have to basically agree with that. And Krista says, true. Also, I often think poltergeist activities are more triggered by religious people. I haven't seen a group of witches deal with problems on ghost hunting shows. A few on YouTube are good. I think part of my reaction to that, Krista, is I think anyone with actual metaphysical training isn't really likely to have that kind of problem. Or if they do, they're going to know how to resolve it much more easily. They're not going to panic over it. I find that I agree with the premise that our and hello to Kazan in the chat room. It's good to see you, Kazan. And I tend to agree that when you have a poltergeist experience, you usually have one of a few things going on. Often it's someone who's just entered into adolescence, and they are experiencing a lot of a lot of energy they're not accustomed to. Sometimes it will be around someone who's just entered menopause and is having a similar experience, and they're dealing with very high energy that they're not sure how to control or how to ground. The other time is someone who is actively involved in psychic development but has not really learned how to control it yet. And in all of these cases, the answer is simply to control and ground the energy. Um, Now, Kai says, um, Kai refers to the TV series The Sixth Sense, and talks about having enjoyed it because it was original. I remember watching The Sixth Sense back in the day, and I was young enough. I don't remember it in great detail, but I remember I quite enjoyed it. And it was for those who don't remember it, it was a television series about a psychic and their adventures in psychic work. It was quite original, quite interesting. Certainly not overly realistic, but it was interesting. And I've always enjoyed that genre. But again, I do tend to like it more as more classical evocations than a lot of the modern ones. It seems to me that back in the 70s and 80s, a lot of the genre moved to to um, to shock and gore rather than um, suspense and mystery and ideas. And I much prefer those that make you think about what you're watching, that raise actual ideas, even if they're raising them from more of a fantasy point of view. Um, and of course, the other time that I find the horror genre particularly interesting is when it's been done in a very artistic style. Dracula, the famous Bela Lugosi version of Dracula, was done in um, a very artistic style, which for me as an artist is interesting to look at and to consider. Another horror film that I'm very fond of is Kwaidan. And if you've never seen Kwaidan and you like artistic films, I highly recommend it. It is a Japanese horror film, I believe from the year of my birth, 1963, possibly 64. And it is from the very first to the very last frame, a highly artistic depiction of a number of traditional Japanese ghost stories. And the visual part of it um, is as interesting as the subject matter, and the subject matter itself is highly interesting, particularly in coming from a different point of view than a Western film would. And hello to Rev Michael in the chat room. It's good to see you, Rev Michael. And hello to Suzanne in the chat room. It's good to see you, Suzanne. Um, I can watch Kwaidan many times and still find new things in it, particularly the part about the Genpei War. Um, and visually, one of the things I really enjoy about how they did that film is that they have these very complex and naturalistic sets. Oh, and Calvin says it was 1964. Thank you, Calvin. Um, these very realistic sets that look like they're being filmed outside, except for the sky, which is obviously a piece of artwork. And I can remember a point in time when I assumed that they actually were filmed outside with a large backdrop erected to be the sky. But no, I found out later they were entirely done on soundstage. And Reverend Kai says, my hubby likes the original Outer Limits and Twilight show, often horror-ish, but with a moral lesson. They were our go-to. They are our go-tos when we stream fatigue. I always enjoyed the Outer Limits and the Twilight Zone. And again, because they made you think. They usually had surprise endings. They weren't necessarily at all realistic, but they were thought-provoking. Um, and I guess part of my take on this is I like entertainment that makes you think. Now, Krista says, I have had over the years several spirits come who needed help to go to the other side. It makes me sad to see haunted houses making money on it rather than helping them move on. I've known a number of people who share that point of view, and that's that's what I was trained to do. If you find a spirit that is trapped between the worlds, you help them to move on. And a spirit trapped between the worlds is what I would call a ghost, how I would use that term, according to how I was trained. And helping them to move on is not an especially difficult matter, at least with the right training. In some cases, it may take a little while, but it's not difficult. And I would hope someone would do that for me if I were trapped between the worlds. And then, of course, we have spirits who have crossed on but still have an interest in this world as ancestors or as spirit guides, who are a totally different thing. But for those who are actually caught between the worlds, I think helping them to move on is the thing to do. And hello to Piyu in the chat room. It's good to see you, Piyu. I love the fact that we have so many people uh, from all over the world who watch the show and speak in the chat room. It's good to see you. Now, getting back to the influence of these things on the community, um, it's not only Hollywood horror that has an influence um, on the community, but also written horror. And again, the Gothic genre from the late 18th and 19th century had a pretty big influence on certain things we do even now, certain ways we look at things even now. And I think that looking at Gothic works, whether written or filmed, um, can sometimes be rather enlightening. One of the ones that I remember um, is one of the two films called The Cat, with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi from, I believe, 1934. And it centers on the idea of a satanic coven. But other than that, everything visual about that coven would be perfectly appropriate in a modern pagan temple, from the way the robes are handled to, if I recall correctly, the way the ceremony is handled. It's a very interesting thing. And um, although horror films often insist on referring to Satanism, a lot of things they do visually are taken from or relate to modern paganism. I think I mentioned recently I'd watched the Snoop Sisters on YouTube recently, a film from about probably 1975. The Snoop Sisters film called The Devil Made Me Do It. The Snoop Sisters, for those of a certain age, you will remember, are Helen Hayes and Mildred Natwick, and they played two elderly amateur detectives. Um, and this was a mystery story involving um, a totally fantasy-oriented satanic coven. But what was interesting is the number of elements they tacked onto this that come out of modern Wicca, or other uh, older or modern metaphysical um, traditions at the same time, and how they just threw this all together. And I'm not quite sure what to say for that, except that it is an interesting aspect of how um, the entertainment media interacts with our community. And with that, I see that we've come to the end of our half hour. I want to thank you for joining me for it. And I wish you a wonderful Wednesday. I will be back again tomorrow. And until next time, let us close with our prayer. And beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. And we ask you to help us to have clarity in how we perceive ourselves and how we portray ourselves. And help us to remember that if we wish to be perceived realistically, then we must take control of our image and portray ourselves as we are, and help us to have the tools to do that. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And Calvin has a lovely closing thought. Blessed be to all of you. And with that said, this Yule season, relax in the glow of the Yule log, friends and family, and perhaps consider something to send a chill down your spine that isn't necessarily from the weather. It's one of the oldest traditions after all, and as Dickens reminds us, let us keep Yule well. And thank you, Calvin. Thank you, everyone. And may you be blessed now and always.